Many critics have accused the four gospel writers of being wrong, and that the four books are not in harmony with each other. And however, the truth is that the four writers are perfectly in harmony upon the subject of Christ's life and work. Now, Matthew describes Christ as the great king and heir to David's throne and the kingdom of Israel. And he was not an apostle or one of the 12 disciples. He was a tax collector. And Mark reveals the Messiah as the servant of Yahweh. And he was only mentioned at the end when he was at the Garden of Gethsemane. And Luke writes of Christ as the perfect man. And he was a Gentile Greek doctor who was not living in Israel at the time. And it is lastly John who powerfully describes Christ as the glorious Son of God. He was the only one who was an eyewitness to all of Jesus' life. And John is also the only one in the New Testament to write both the gospel and the letters. Paul wrote a lot of letters, but he doesn't write the gospel. Now, the accounts mentioned in John chapters 2 to chapter 4 are not mentioned by Matthew, Mark, and Luke. When we come to John chapter 5, this was around the time as Matthew chapter 8, Mark chapter 2, and Luke chapter 5. So we can see from John's record that he's very, very selective. He just picks out a few things, and most of the ministry of Jesus, John doesn't talk about at all. So it's quite different from the others. And what this is telling us is that John is picking out certain things that are not always mentioned. And when we come to the question, why is the miracle called a sign? It is worth considering the way in which the world today has reduced the meaning of miracle to a mere idea. For example, if an unfavored horse wins a race, it's called a miracle. If a dangerous fire in a large retail building store is brought under control, even that in the modern day now is considered a miracle, and that the building was not destroyed or burned to the ground. So such is the world. Instead of the word being associated with the hand of God, it is now used to describe almost any event which could be termed wonderful or marvelous. So the Greek word that John uses, and as mentioned by Brother Max in his opening remarks, is the word semeion, and apologies if I pronounced it incorrectly, and is mentioned 77 times in the New Testament and translated sign or miracle. And because John wants to convince his readers that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. And again, following on from Brother Max's remarks, it means a token or mark and further adding on to that, it is used to show us, for an example, a directional sign. So we would have seen this today. You're driving here or during your daily lives, that these signs you might see on the road. So a good example would be these signs, street sign or stop sign. It's directing you to do something or not do something. So it's quite different from the normal word of miracle. Now, as we dive back into our reading this evening, in verse 1, which reads, "After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem." Now, it seems that this could have been the Passover, and most writers seem to agree that it was. Now, the tricky thing was what was going on. As we look more into our reading this evening in verse 2, which reads, "Now there is at Jerusalem by the sheep market a pool, which is called in the Hebrew tongue Bethesda, having 5 porches." Now, this is a map of Jerusalem. And here's the pool of Bethesda, as you can see up on the top, which means the house of mercy. And this is the New Testament Jerusalem during the time of Christ. And as you can see as well, here's the temple. And there's the pool of Bethesda. So it's in the northeast section of Jerusalem. And when we continue to read John chapter 5, it mentions that he came through the sheep gate. And as mentioned in verse 2, as per the translation in the ESV, it is the sheep gate. And here is a picture of a sheep gate. It's a very old picture. And during Nehemiah's day, when they rebuilt the walls, there's the sheep gate again. And this was the first gate that they rebuilt when Nehemiah came back. And this was the sheep gate. The sheep came in through that gate to go into the temple to be sacrificed. So that was the important aspect of rebuilding the city. The focus was actually going to be on the temple. Now, as you can see from this picture, just taken 16 years ago, not so very recent one, in 2008, which is actually in the Muslim quarter, and that this is what it looks like in the modern day. Now, if you look closely on each side of the entrance, there and there, these are actually from 1517, when the Ottoman Turks were around Jerusalem at the time. These carvings, they believed to be lions, and that's why they call it the Lion's Gate today, because of these carvings that you see here. The two that look like 2 lions, but although in actual fact they are leopards. And to some very interesting history, During the Six-Day War in 1967, the Israeli paratroopers came in, and when they took the old city, they actually went through the ship gate to enter the city and took over the city, and Jerusalem became Israel's. So it's quite interesting to look back into history. Now, still in verse 2 of our reading this evening. Now there is at Jerusalem by the sheep market a pool which is called in the Hebrew tongue Bethesda, having 5 porches. Now, as you can see in this slide, a scale model of ancient Jerusalem. And this is a close-up view to that. And the 5 porches are porticos or colonnades as per the translation in the ESV. And these are covered walkways, as you can see, all around, with columns which support the roof. And another 3D model showing the pool of Bethesda had an upper north pool and a southern lower pool. Now the northern upper pool, which you can see up here, was like a reservoir that supplied the water to the southern lower pool. And it is in this lower pool here that Christ heals the man. And that is how you would basically number the 5 porches. Now, as we come back to our reading in verse 4, which reads, "For an angel went down at a certain season into the pool and troubled the water. Whosoever then first, after the troubling of the water, stepped in was made whole of whatsoever disease he had." My dear brothers and sisters, when we come to think of it, is that true? Or is that what the people thought was true? So you can believe that this troubling of the water can have the ability to cure you, and you jump in, and because sometimes the way you think basically affects the way you feel in your body. You may think you've been cured or healed, and it's just in your mind. So there's quite a bit of a debate as to whether those words represent a true statement by divine inspiration from God, or this actually happened and it was an angel actually doing it. Or in many other writers think, well, maybe that's what superstitious people thought. And others think there was an underground spring there, which caused a bubbling effect, but it doesn't change the miracle that Jesus did. So it would be rather strange if for only one person to be healed. Now, why weren't they all healed? What is God trying to say here? It is very difficult to get healed. Is that what we all know about God? God would be very happy to do that if you wanted to be healed. Just jump into the pool. And on many occasions, Jesus healed a multitude of people. So it's a little bit unusual. And as we come back to our reading, in verse 5, which reads, "And a certain man was there, which had an infirmity 38 years." Now, this is very specific and incredibly significant. It doesn't say about 40 years or about 30 years. It's very specific. In the Old Testament, it mentions 38 years in Deuteronomy chapter 2, verse 14. Now, Deuteronomy is Moses talking to the Israelites just before they crossed the river Jordan and went into the land. And Moses did not reach the promised land. So these are his last words in Deuteronomy. And just on a side note, while I was doing my study, I read this and I remembered when I attended a school, an all boarding boys school, there was the school and the area that was out of the school compound was called the Promised Land. Just as Moses could see the land, we were never allowed to set foot on it. So kind of reminded me of that. So coming back to Deuteronomy chapter 2, verse 14, which reads, "And the space in which we came from Kadesh Barnea until we were come over the brook Zered was 38 years." So that's not a coincidence if you think about it. And what this verse is saying is that they took a few weeks to get to Mount Sinai. And they stayed there a year. The spies were sent out, and most of them said, "Oh, it's too hard. We won't go into the land. We want to go back to Egypt." So God said, "You will wander in the wilderness," and it actually turned out to be for 38 years. From then, they went up to where Mount Nebo is, which is there. Camped down next to the Jordan River for a little while, and then they crossed over. So that's 40 years in total. But the 38 years is specifically mentioned as the time they were wandering around. And the same as Israel in the wilderness with Moses. So that's really significant. Now, what this is telling us is that this man represented the nation of Israel. He was like Israel in the wilderness, hopeless and all going to die off. Well, everyone over 20 was going to die. This man was obviously over 20 years of age. He's been sick for 38 years. So he may well have been 40 years or 50 years old, and we are not told. And he is in a hopeless position. Under the law of Moses, people were in a hopeless position, and the law could not save you. So faith saves you, and that saves us today, which we read about a lot in the New Testament. Now, from our reading tonight, verse 6 to verse 9 just records as Jesus heals the men. And in verse 6, which read, "When Jesus saw him lie and knew that he had been now a long time in that case, He said unto him, Wilt thou be made whole? Wilt thou be made whole? Now, our individual awareness and acknowledgement of our own sicknesses of human nature is needed for our healing, whether they be natural or spiritual. And in verse 7, the impotent man answered him, Sir, I have no man, when the water is troubled, to put me into the pool. But while I am coming, another steppeth down before me. Sir, I have no man, he said. Now this was the confession given by the man, and it shows us that help cannot come from the flesh. And also, as mentioned in Psalm 146, in verses 3, which reads, Put not your trust in princes, nor in the Son of Man, in whom there is no help. His breath goeth forth, he returneth to his earth. In that very day his thoughts perish. Happy is he that hath the God of Jacob for his help, whose hope is in the Lord his God. And as we come back to our reading in verse 8, Jesus said unto him, Rise, take up thy bed and walk. So, my dear brothers and sisters, this is a command for us to demonstrate the principles of faith. For without faith, it is impossible to please God. Now, note the progression from the second sign, which involved only belief. Here in this third sign, we see the need for faith in action as shown by Abraham. And in verse 9, which reads, And immediately the man was made whole and took up his bed and walked. And on the same day was the Sabbath. And what a significant act in this second part of verse 9. That day was the Sabbath. Now just think about this for a moment. Jesus could have gone to the pool the day before or the day after and done the exact same thing and would not have upset the Jewish authorities. He would not have been accused of breaking the Sabbath. But he deliberately did this on the Sabbath. And what I found quite interesting is that Jesus did 6 other miracles on the Sabbath day. So that's 7 in total. 7th day of the week, he does 7 miracles deliberately on that day. So quite interesting. Now, in our reading, it was also mentioned in verse 10. Which reads, The Jews therefore said unto him that was cured, It is the Sabbath day. It is not lawful for thee to carry thy bed. And again in verse 16, And therefore did the Jews persecute Jesus and sought to slay him because he had done these things on the Sabbath day. And lastly, in verse 18, Therefore the Jews sought the more to kill him because he not only had broken the Sabbath, but said also that God was his Father. So making himself equal with God. And Jesus says to the man, "Go and sin no more," in verse 14. I think that's really important because we are in a position when we've been healed at baptism from all our past sins, and we are told to sin no more. Now, this is Christ's answer to why he performed this miracle on the Sabbath. Back in verse 17. But Jesus answered them, "My Father worketh hitherto, and I work." So Christ is saying here, God has been working on the Sabbath. Why can't I? And this is a very interesting answer if you think about it. If we think back to creation, on the seventh day, it says God rested. But in fact, Jesus is actually saying here that God is still working. So God may have stopped creating, but he's doing other things, looking after his people on earth and doing different kind of work. But he is still working. And moving on to verse 18, which reads, "Therefore the Jews sought the more to kill him, because he not only had broken the Sabbath, but said also that God was his Father, making himself equal with God." Now this said, because you call God your Father, or you are making yourself equal to God. Now we all know that that's not true, my dear brothers and sisters. Calling God his Father, he was not claiming equality with God. When we call God our Father, which we do, does that mean we think that we are equal with him? Of course not. There's clearly a difference between a father and a son, and even in my family. I, for example, am not equal to my own father. And moving on into verse 19, which reads, "Then answered Jesus and said unto them, Verily, verily, I say unto you, the Son can do nothing of himself, but what he seeth the Father do, for what things soever he doeth, these also doeth the Son likewise." So this is related to the statement that God was working through him. This dispels the blasphemy and the accusation and shows the mission of Jesus, which was to do the Father's will. Now Jesus was now showing by signs that the rest which remains for the people of God would be characterized by the healing of all human ills. Now in this verse, Jesus continues to discuss his relationship with his Father by referring to himself as the Son of God, and as mentioned in Psalm 2, verse 7, which reads, "I will declare the decree, the Lord hath said unto me, Thou art my Son, this day have I begotten thee." So in this psalm, in verse 6 of Psalm 2, the title was applied to Christ as King. And in Isaiah chapter 9, there was another reference to Jesus as the Messiah, by a fivefold title. And in verse 6, for unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be Wonderful Counselor, the Mighty God, Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. So at Bethesda, as we've looked into the pool, the house of mercy, where the five porches were the men of the five titles reveal the grace of God, and grace being represented by the number 5. And to the last verse of our reading tonight. For the Father loveth the Son, and sheweth him all things that himself doeth, and he will shew him greater works than these, that ye may marvel. So, my dear brothers and sisters, the miracle was a sign teaching us that the Lord can strengthen us to rise above our own weaknesses. And Paul recognized his need, and he mentioned this in the following words: when I would do good, evil is present with me. O wretched man that I am, I thank God through Jesus Christ, our Lord. So the instruction to rise was the key word in this sign. As we looked at briefly tonight, rise from corruptible earthly things to higher spiritual things. This lesson was stressed in the words recorded later in the same chapter in verse 25, which I'll read. Verily, verily, I say unto you, the hour is coming, and now is, when the dead shall hear the voice of the Son of God, and they that hear shall live. So the man reacted trustingly, and by doing so, he identified himself with the will of Christ. He showed no sign of doubt or disbelief. And he acted at Christ's command and was healed. And Jesus, the Lamb of God, comes through the sheep gate that we looked at briefly tonight. And he is the future gate for people to enter the sheepfold. John writes that he's called the Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world. Once we appreciate such a merciful act, we have duties to fulfill. It is an act of thankfulness to maintain his request, even if we do not appreciate the full meaning of why it should be requested. But to put away sloth, carry thy bed, and walk each day ready for the opportunity to declare him who has given us joy, and is only a reasonable service. So the men recognized the need to be saved. My dear brothers and sisters, do we? Do we recognize our need to really acknowledge that without Christ in our lives, we are nothing? Once the man was healed, he sought to proclaim it. How do we act when we try to learn the truth? Every day that we live represents us with an opportunity to follow Jesus or to follow the world. What will we do with this opportunity, my dear brothers and sisters? We spend our time as the rest of the world does, trying to accumulate things and seeking fleshly pleasures. Now, if we follow in the example of Jesus, we will spend our time glorifying God and actually serving others. For by grace are ye saved through faith. It is the gift of God. To appreciate forgiveness, being made whole, calls for a holy way of life. Go and sin no more.